Good evening, all, and welcome. I again have the utmost pleasure in welcoming the Incredible Darkness Tales to tonight's video. It's time to get comfortable around the campfire and let the darkness take control. A couple of summers ago, my girlfriend and I were camping in Chequamegon National Forest in northern Wisconsin. And after our experience, we do not plan to return unless we go with a large group of people. My girlfriend and I are from Chicago, so northern Wisconsin was our go place for R&R. We've done a number of hiking trips in northern Wisconsin, but never to this area. We are not backpacking experts, but we have been to a number of national parks and have been out hiking and exploring when we can find the time away from work. We love getting away from people and relaxing in nature, but this trip made us appreciate the presence of other people around us in unfamiliar places. Our plan was to hike a remote section of the Northern Country Trail. The North Country Trail is a national scenic trail, like the Appalachian Trail, but it gets much less use. In some parts of northern Wisconsin, the trail is very remote, and the only access is via logging roads. We plan to hike 15 miles along the trail to a backpack shelter and spend the night and hike back to the car the following day. We spent the night at a friend's house in Warsaw, and we set out early the next day to the trailhead. As we entered the National Forest boundary, we were captivated by the beauty of the thick green forest. I drove slowly along the gravel logging roads as we made our way to our parking spot. While we were driving to the trailhead, we passed a couple of people standing next to a parked truck on the side of the road. They appeared to be hillbillies, as they had a rusted out, bunged up pickup truck, complete with Confederate bumper stickers. As we drove past, I waved, and they stared back without returning the greeting. Friendly people, I thought to myself. After we passed them, I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed that they were still staring at us. And before we rounded a bend, I glanced back into the mirror again and saw them watching us through the haze of dust road. My girlfriend and I joked about the up north people, but we did not think anything about this encounter. Aside from those people, we did not encounter anyone else on the remote logging roads within the National Forest boundary. We found the trailhead about 15 minutes later, after winding our way through the narrow logging roads. There was no one else parked at the trailhead, a perfect chance to get some needed solitude, fresh air, and relaxation. After parking and making sure the car was locked, we hoisted our packs and set off on the trail. The weather was relatively cool, which thankfully kept the mosquitoes and biting flies at bay. We took pictures along the way, and we marveled at the lushness of the forest and the topography of the glacial moraine. After a solid 8 hours of hiking, we found our campsite. It consisted of wooden backpack shelter and a fire ring. Even though the shelter provided ample space for us, we opted to set up our tent in a small clearing about 100 feet behind the shelter. We built a fire at the shelter fire ring, and I boiled water for our dehydrated trail food. As we ate, we watched the sky slowly turn dark. My girlfriend and I passed around a Nalgene filled with wine, and we marveled at how many stars you could see away from the city. When the fire was reduced to a small pile of glowing embers, we decided to head back to the tent. We settled into our tent and looked through the pictures we took that day, but after lugging a heavy pack for 15 miles and drinking some wine, I was ready for some shut-eye. When we camped at state and national parks, I usually wore earplugs, but that night there were no RVs or any other campers to make noise. So I closed my eyes and let the noise of the forest lull me to sleep. My girlfriend was very uneasy that night, but she normally had some apprehension whenever we were sleeping away from home. I'm not sure when we drifted to sleep, but we were awoken by a bone-chilling noise. It was pitch dark outside, and over the insects in the forest, I heard a dull thud. It sounded like someone was hitting two logs together. My girlfriend and I were wide awake at this point, and we lay silently in our tent, hearing the noise again. Our old tent had mesh windows, but the backpacking tent we were using had no windows. We could only guess at what was making the noise outside of our tent. We initially thought that an animal got at our food and garbage bag, which we left in the shelter, but the noise was too distinct, and it did not sound like rustling through food wrappers or our camp equipment. Our hearts were pounding as we heard the persistent knock in the darkness. Unarmed and scared shitless, we didn't know what to do. I would normally have carried a can of bear spray, but I decided to leave it at home to save on weight against the wishes of my girlfriend. The knocking continued, but we remained still as to not to give away our location. For all we knew, whatever was making the noise had already spotted our tent. After what seemed like an eternity, the knocking sound ceased. We lay in complete silence, with only the dull buzz of the insects in the background. Then we heard it. Leaves rustling, a branch breaking, and voices. We heard low talking in the distance. We could not make out what was being said, but it sounded like a couple of people speaking in the distance. The voices continued for a bit, but to our relief, the voices did not seem to be getting louder. Whoever was out there did not spot the tent, or decided to leave us alone. We sat in our tent for the rest of the night, adrenaline surging through our veins. At the first light, we slowly left the tent, and when we emerged, I looked around in all directions to see if anyone was out there. But I only saw the forest and the backpack shelter. We quickly rolled up our sleeping bags and camp pads and put our tent away. When we got to the shelter, my girlfriend screamed in horror. On the entrance to the shelter, the wood was freshly cut to reveal the word "kill" cut into the shelter wall. And there were a number of axe and knife cuts where someone was chopping at the wall. I looked at the ground and saw a scattering of fresh splinters. After grabbing our food supply and garbage bag, we got the hell out of there. We were nearly jogging with our gear as we made our way back to the car. I kept glancing back over my shoulder and gazing out through the woods to see if anyone was following. We traversed the glacial eskers that we stored the day before, and we knew we were getting close. We were quietly rejoicing as we neared the trailhead. We made it back to the trailhead in near record time, but something was wrong. The windshield wiper on my car was sticking straight up, and there was something stuck to the wiper. As we inched closer to the car, I saw there was blood smeared on the windshield, and a squirrel carcass was impaled on the wiper blade. Hair and blood still stuck to the wiper and on the hood of the car. I didn't bother cleaning the car. We threw our gear in the trunk and sped off without removing the animal from the wiper blade. As I sped down the logging road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but I could not see anything through the cloud of dust behind the car. When we got to the gas station in the nearest town, I removed the carcass with a wad of newspaper, and I tried to remove as much dried blood as I could. I filled up on gas, and we didn't stop until we made it to Milwaukee. This was the last trip I took to the woods of northern Wisconsin.
I was working as a prospector's assistant in central Manitoba one summer. We were doing a helicopter-assisted magnetic anomaly investigation. Best summer of my life. There's nothing like the ringing in your ears dissipating after the helicopter has dropped you off and the slowly increasing volume of the bugs taking its place. You know for sure you're in the middle of nowhere. It was the last day of our campaign. This was a little piece of the property close enough to a road that we didn't need a helicopter. It was a low priority target and was saved till the end. We had kicked so much ass during the high priority targets that we decided to do this one on the last day, just for an easy in and out of the bush. Around 9 a.m. we heard yelling in the bush. Odd. Nobody else should be out here. We keep on grabbing samples and it's in the back of our mind. Around 11, we hear it again. A little closer this time. We call back, but again it's silent. Now, through our travels at this 30-kilometer piece of property, we came across many pieces of animal evidence. Deer, moose, and rabbit droppings were everywhere. A few carcasses here and there, bear tracks and bear feces were seen a few times, but nothing prepared us for what happened next. Around noon, we were in an old blast hole from the 80s. Prospector Dave told me he used to have a blasting license, and that blowing shit up in the middle of the forest while drinking beer was a favorite pastime of prospectors, until they changed the laws after a few too many forest fires. We were facing due west with our GPS on some rock, getting the most precise UTM it could, when we hear an earth-shattering, bone-chilling howl. I looked at Dave, and he turned so white he was almost green. I picked up the GPS and put it in my belt and unclipped my bear spray safety. Then, at our 9 o'clock, facing due west, another wolf. Then another at our 10. Then another and another, all the way to our 4. Dave calmly said, "We need to leave, but you can't run. If you run, you die." We left most of our sampling shit there. We also carried these modified steel sledge hammers for breaking rock and scraping moss. Most useful, durable thing I've ever had. It's at the ready along with my bear spray and we walk. Longest walk of my entire life. We didn't say a word. I didn't hear anything, but I'm positive they followed us back to the road and into the truck. We drove back to town and proceeded to get thoroughly drunk to forget about it.
On a 5-mile hike off a main route in our local woods, we just packed food, drinks, and fire starting gear, and there were only 4 of us. It was around 11 p.m. when a friend of mine said he was going to walk alone back to the cars, to take his and go get more drinks, as the only place to sell them would have been about a 15 to 20 mile hike away. We all told him not to bother, because of how late it was. But Despite us, he left regardless. I gave him my good maglite and he went off. About 60 minutes after he left, the noises started. It sounded like a cross between an injured bear and a person pretending to be Bigfoot. I figured it must have been my friend, and we all called out to him and got no response. There were no more noises. Another 15 minutes pass, and we figure he's either already left or passed out in the woods. Another 15 minutes pass, and we figure he either really left or passed out in the woods. So the remaining 3 of us go and check on the cars and make sure he has made it. All we had was one of those bad lanterns and a phone light to guide us. After about a mile or so, we hear the noises again. We called out and got no response, but we heard the sound of branches snapping and rustling towards our camp. We decide that one person will head to the cars and the other 2 will return to camp. I ended up being one of the 2 to head back. My second friend took the lantern and we walked back, just using a bit of moonlight and a phone. We walked for a mile but didn't see our campfire. But we could smell the smoke, and after about 10 minutes of searching, we found the ashes. It didn't burn out. It was smothered by water, not by us. And I remember that we took care to build a rock barrier around it and didn't put it out to locate it later, just so that Smokey the Bear didn't come and tell us off. Enough to say, we were freaked out not having seen anyone else there. We couldn't start a new fire, so we decided to cut and run, loaded our stuff except for one item, and hiked for about a mile until we roughly hit the spot where we separated from our second friend, and we heard the noise again. This time much closer and right behind us. It was time to dash, we thought, for only about 2 miles anyhow, as I couldn't handle more than that, as I'm a bit of a bigger guy. We only went back to walking when we hit the trail, not just cutting through forest, and we felt safe, knowing that the cars would be in sight any moment now. We got to where the cars were parked, and something seemed off. 2 of the 3 cars were missing. Friend 2 had left his car, and we had no idea why. We loaded up and hopped into my car and went to leave, but noticed the car was leaning. We got out, checked the tires, and noticed a knife dug into one. My knife. I pulled it out, realizing that it was mine, checked, and noticed that mine was gone. Shit. We started walking down the highway, still in deep woods towards the town. My other friend saw us, picked us up, and we left. We came back for the car the next day. Finally, we got everyone together and discussed the night. My first friend said that he left, got drinks, flirted with the cashier, picked us up, and that was it. My other friend's story is what freaked us all out. He said he heard all the noises right around the time that we split up, and he went to go back to the cars, turned, and in the distance saw a human outline standing there watching him, holding up a small knife. They stared at one another for about 30 seconds before the figure ran towards him. He popped into his car and bolted. Don't know who to believe except for what I've seen, but I haven't camped in those woods yet. Who knows how many times we got within feet of this supposed 5th person. Shit.
A couple of years ago, I was stressed out from college and big city life and decided to spend a long weekend in the woods doing what my city friends consider utter lunacy and us outdoorsy people consider nirvana. Deep woods free camping. In the winter, alone. While this sounds like the beginning of a missing persons report, if you're an experienced outdoorsman, it's pretty safe. I also take a secret pleasure in being the white trash warrioress my dad had always hoped I'd be. I always hated the feeling of claustrophobia that came with being a female in the city. Avoiding eye contact, not walking alone at night. When you're a girl alone in the woods, you're in charge. You're safe within the warm embrace of your own solitary freedom. Or so I thought. I spent a few hours on the roads, the surroundings getting wilder and wilder as I drove. I parked in a loud roadside ditch, and with a compass and map hiked until I was in miles reach or so of some good ice fishing. I was at least 4 miles from the road. I made an extremely discreet camp in the clearing with just one little hole in the snow for my tiny tent and my tiny campfire. And after a couple of beautiful days of just hiking and relaxing around camp, I made the trek to the fishing hole. Everything was in utter winter stillness. The air was crisp, and the only signs that I wasn't in a perfect vacuum were the twitterings of birds and very distant rumblings of the half-frozen waterfalls. After a mile or so of crunching along the snow, I silently celebrated my compass skills when I came out at the exact place I had intended to. I punched a hole in the thin crust of ice and set to getting my fish on. My first catch came quickly. After a few weeks under a frozen surface, fishes be hungry and shit. I was feeling oddly fatigued and jumpy, so I decided to just clean the fish here and now. Take it straight back to camp to cook. Yummy. I quickly realized my fish preparation skills were rusty at best. I cursed my lack of preparation as I cut myself for the second time. Something in my peripheral senses was irritating me. But I was very set in my task, focusing on the motions in the slippery mess. The thing in my periphery was growing more irritating, like the buzzing of a fly or the yammering of a sibling. I carved and hacked and sliced my hand open freshly as the fish slipped out of my hands and into the snow. Frustrated, I shouted, "Shut up with that whistling, will you?" Silence resumed. And then my heart stopped. Living in a college neighborhood, I had grown so accustomed to white noise that I had failed to recognize how grossly inappropriate this sound was in this context. The silence weighed down on me as I broke into a sweat. The only reason a human would be this deep in the woods would be to hunt. And no hunter would give himself away like that. And if he was whistling for any other reason, shouldn't he have reacted to my outburst? Yelled something vulgar back, apologized? No. Nothing. Just the total stillness of the woods. Silence as pure as it was before I spoke. Unsure if I had misheard the twitterings of a bird or something, I just decided the fish was a lost cause, slung my gear over my shoulder and headed for camp. I trudged off in the woods, and about a quarter mile from camp, I saw a large mass protruding from the snow. Apprehensive but drawn like a moth to the flame, I trudged up to what materialized in closing distance as a moose kill. A really, really good moose kill. A clean shot through the upturned eye staring at me. Staring at me and saying something. Saying something that was imposing a sense of dread on me. But a dread I couldn't translate. I ran. I ran hard and I ran fast. In the snow and the woods, everything looked the same to me. I knew I was moving south and I knew I'd passed camp on the east. I made for the road, eventually slowing down to a weary trudge, calming at the comforting sight of woods clearing ahead to make way for the country roadway. I looked to my left and saw my car 50 yards or so down. I jogged to it and drove the lonely 15 miles to the first motel I saw signs for. I had none of my belongings, and no earthly idea why I had just abandoned ship like that. It was only as I was sitting out, watching infomercials that night that it started to fall together. Why would the Park Service issue free camp passes for the same stretch of woods that they allowed hunting? The moose defied everything of my rudimentary understanding of hunting. Even with the snow to cool it, decomposition starts quickly on an animal that size. You'd have time for a few quick pictures, but you'd want to have it dressed quickly. Why would you kill a moose 5 miles into the forest? How could you ever drag it back to the road? In the morning, in a sleep-deprived and paranoid state, I described everything I'd seen and thought to a very confused park ranger. He seemed more vexed about illegal hunting than any of my crazy city girl ramblings. He said he wanted to come pick me up and have me take him where I thought the kill site was. I said I was only going if he brought me a gun. He sighed and with exasperation told me when to meet him. We rode out into the woods on an ATV, with me awkwardly riding on the back as if on the back of the world's awkwardest motorcycle. We got to a large impression in the snow where the moose had been. There was also the distinct track of the carcass being dragged. The drag marks made a smooth trail in the snow, as if the carcass were on a tarp. The ranger said he would take me back now. He asked where my camp was. I pointed in the direction of the drag marks. It looked like he was finally sharing in my unease. Back at the hotel, I washed my clothes in the sink and prepared to drive home in the morning. An unknown number called my phone. It was the park ranger. The moose had been dragged to my campsite. He described the scene as a huge mess. He wasn't sure if an animal had helped to make the mess, but one thing was clear. Someone had cut into my tent with a knife. I asked about the rest of my belongings. He said darkly, "You don't want them back. They're covered in moose mess." So, what happens now? Well, miss, we're just gonna keep an eye out for this guy. I haven't heard of or seen anything like this ever before. I'm really sorry this happened. And that was it. No closure, no explanation. In the years that have passed, I've tried every different application of reason. A hunter who needed help, but knew I was already gone. A deranged psychopath looking to make his second kill. One of the few friends I shared the story with envisioned him as some deep-wood Sweeney Todd he dubbed Moosey Todd. I still don't know why I didn't hear the gunshot. The whistling seemed so vivid in my memory. But was it even real? One question has definitely been answered. I'll never go into the woods alone again.
I work in the outdoor field and lead trips regularly. I once led a trip to the top of Mount Stinger in North Carolina. It's a tough climb to get to the top and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids and had one co-instructor. We were camping out on top of the mountain, and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock that night. I was really into a book, and was reading it as I stayed up until about 10 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon, and from the position that I was in, I could see down the trail that we hiked to get to the top. I laid there enjoying the scenery, and noticed something moving on the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We're in the middle of nowhere, and there was someone hiking up a trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was just frozen, watching this person move closer to our camp. As they arrived at the top of the mountain where we were, and just stopped, I watched, as it appeared to be a man, and he was surveying our camp. I really could only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed to be about 30 minutes, but may have been around 10. He just turned, sat down under a tree facing our camp, and he was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there staring at us. I had no idea what to do. I decided to wait it out. I waited, just staring at the man while he stared at my camp. This went on until around 3:30. Then, he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down to the trail he came up. To this day, I have no idea what the hell that was about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed for the rest of the trip. I often wonder though, did he notice me? Did he have ill intent? And the only reason he didn't pursue was because he assumed I couldn't see him, or was waiting for me to go asleep before he could strike. I'm glad I never had to find out.
This encounter takes place several years ago, in a remote part of the Australian outback. For a bit of background, I'm a pretty built 6'2" dude, and I was around 26 years old at the time. Now on to the story. I was on a road trip with a mate, traveling around the central Queensland outback in my old semi-reliable Nissan X-Trail. We're both science zoology nerds and had heard about this amazing dinosaur trail out this way, which is basically a grouping of 3 areas, Winton, Richmond, and Hughenden, that have previous dino bone discoveries. Still have fossils as well as seriously awesome dinosaur tracks with preserved foot imprints. We were staying at a place 3 hours from Winton for a couple days, and we're pretty keen to check out this trail. So we made the decision to do the 6-hour round trip in a day. We were pretty ambitious and kind of stupid back then. We left at 9 a.m. in the morning. Car packed with lunch, several liters of water, and my trusty GPS, and off we went. It was a long drive, and halfway through, my air conditioning decided to cark it. If any of you live in or have visited Australia in the summer, you know it's brutally hot. So I'm sure you can imagine the 3-hour trip there without air conditioning, with the eventuality of the 6-hour round trip, was hell. To make matters worse, my GPS also stopped working as the map software didn't recognize the area we were in. Luckily, I had an old Reef FedEx in my back seat, but it was pretty tough to revert to map reading when you're used to a computer screen telling you where to go. Especially given we're taking the Australian outback here, complete with dirt tracks for roads and very limited signage. But I digress. Finally, we make it to the trail, and kick around there for a couple hours. Not gonna lie, it was pretty awesome. Then decide to make the trip back as it was starting to get later in the afternoon and we didn't want to be driving in the outback in the dark. As we were about to leave, this gnarly old guy, who appeared to be an employee of the trail company dressed all in khaki and camouflage gear, asked us about where we were from and where we were headed. He gave me the stink eye when I was vague with the details, but my mate told him the name of the town we were staying. He took a real liking to my mate, and he laughed when he told him about our lengthy journey in. Apparently we had taken the long route, and there was a much quicker way to get back that would shave about an hour off the trip. We jumped at the directions he gave us. Ain't nobody got time for an extra hour in an air-conditionless oven. All verbal, which we wrote down. Off we went on our merry way, thinking how lucky we were to have met this old dude who gave us some sweet intel on a shortcut home. But I can't deny, there was definitely a creep vibe coming off of him. Based on the directions he gave us, we went winding along several roads in the area I'd never been in, and eventually settled straight on this narrow dirt road. We were supposed to reach an intersection about an hour and a half ago. Take a right and continued on the road till we got to a main highway that would take us back. After an hour and a half of driving on this dirt trail though, we still hadn't reached this intersection. And I was starting to freak out a bit, thinking we'd missed the turn. But my mate was completely chilled out and was sure we'd get there eventually. I think he thought I was driving too slowly, but there are kangaroos out here, man. Those things are dangerous if you hit one. We'd been traveling for a while now. It was getting later and later in the day, and it got to the point where the petrol in the tank was only a quarter full. There were no houses, other roads, or cars in sight, and I was really not comfortable with where this was headed. The middle of nowhere. in a remote area in the wasteland that is the Australian outback. There weren't even any trees. Only this dirt road and desolate, dry brushland and shrubs as far as the eye could see. I stopped the car and tell my mate to get the binoculars out of the back, to take a look around in case he sees a landmark. Yes, I carried binoculars in my car. Still do. He obliges and can just make out a house-like structure not too far in the distance. So we made the decision to head for that. We figured it could be a house that maybe people would be nice enough to give us some petrol and top us up, and some better directions out of here. As we neared this structure, it became apparent that it was not a house at all. We pulled up out front, and see that it's an old caravan that has been burned to a shell from the inside out. It's still got 3 blackened partial walls up though, so we can't see all the way in. And it looks like someone's been there recently, because there's animal bones strung up all over the place, and a cow skull in the entrance of the caravan. Some of the animal bone things even have grass or horsehair woven into them, and they were arranged like decorations. Then we see this hand-painted sign that's been staked into the ground with the words, Moonlight Motel on it. My alarm bells are ringing loud and clear. I nudge my friend to say, let's get the fuck out, but he's distracted by something in the distance. It's a car, coming in the direction we had just come from. Would have been only 10 minutes behind us the entire time we were driving, but I didn't see it once. It's kicking up a ton of dust, which indicates that it's coming toward us fast. It is at this point that we both hear this creepy scratching sound coming from the burned out caravan, like someone scratching at the wall from the inside. I move a little closer to try and see what it is, and there's a person in there peeking out at us from a hole in the damaged wall. Then this childlike voice, that's obviously a grown man imitating a little girl, giggles and says,
Are you here to play with me?
My mate and I both look at each other and book it out of there, back to the inner sanctum of the X-Trail. Just as I'm about to reverse, the other car stops behind mine, with the high beams on. I can't see the driver, but they're in my way, so I can't reverse out from where I'm stationed. I have no choice but to drive forward and turn around that way, narrowly missing the staked motel sign. As we're turning to leave, the driver starts blaring the horn, just hammering it for no reason at all. I just speed off back in the direction we came, and the other car doesn't follow. It's getting to twilight at this stage, and pretty dangerous to be out in these country roads since it's dark, because of the kangaroo situation. But we're feeling a bit better as we manage to navigate our way back to where we came from, the Dino Trail, and even start to joke around about what happened. The person in the other car was probably just honking at us to get our attention to help with directions or something. I pull into the parking lot and got to the front desk area of the company that runs the tours. I explained that we had gotten lost on our way back to town we were staying at, and the lady there is kind enough to just give us enough petrol for the ride back. I couldn't help myself. It mentioned to her that her workmate is a real jerk for giving us those weird directions. We figured that there was no way we messed up the advice he'd given us. And she gives me a weird look, and asks me to describe the guy. I do, and her face goes funny, and she says, "That man does not work here. I saw him talking with a tourist today, and my boss asked him to leave. He kept trying to get the details of where people were staying and telling them that he had vacancies at his place, and they could stay there. The Moonlight Motel."
I have spent more than 1,000 days in the backcountry over the past decade. I have always been drawn to the wild. It seems like home, and I generally know my neighbors out there. I'm not afraid to be in the deep woods in the dark. I love my woods. But one sunny weekday afternoon, I had dirt biked up an old mining road. It gained a couple of 1,000 feet from the valley floor, towards one of the ridges of the cascade. When the road gave out near the bottom of a high basin, I put on my backpack and started off cross-country towards the ridge. It was still heavily forested, old growth, an old cut, fading into another 1,000 feet into those scraggy, wind-blown ones near the top. About 20 minutes in, and about half a mile up from me, near the tree line, I heard this thumping sound. It was very odd, so I stopped to listen, carefully. It sounded like a big, solid branch was being whacked against a solid tree. I used the term solid because the hits were powerful. One or both of the pieces of wood were hard and dry, the wood resonating and brang on impact, as dry wood does. I couldn't get over the power though. It sounded like someone was swinging a 4-inch post. Weird, right? Well, it gets better. This someone sounded like they were trying to communicate. The thumping had a very complex and well-defined pattern. And here's the weirdest part. The thumping signal occasionally became very rapid, like what a drummer could do if they were noodling around with a stick. But I swear, it sounded like a 4-inch post was being treated as lightly as a drumstick. I listened for about 5 minutes, just fascinated with the sound and code and the power of it. Then the drumming suddenly stopped, and I kind of woke up to the fear of this unknowing thing out there. And I had my bear spray and my knife. I only really fear cougars, and even then, I figured they'll have a bad day trying to take me down. Still, the silence as I stared into the forest ahead seemed loaded, and I turned on my heels and left the valley. That place and that experience gave me the chills, and that very high valley won't see my shadow again. I've read stories about how some of the native peoples around there having valleys that they just wouldn't go into. I can now easily understand how these legends started. And, from what I've investigated prior to this event, it certainly sounds like a Bigfoot report to me. But I'll leave the conclusions down to you.
Summer camp counselor here. I work every summer for a camp for 5 weeks. At one time we were backpacking to the tallest peak in my state. At night, me and a coworker/friend went on a night hike to get away from the kids. We laid down on a slope in a patch of grass to stargaze about a quarter mile from everyone else. As we were laying, I heard the beautiful sound of water running behind me, and I mean beautiful. I've never heard water running before and thought to myself, wow, this sounds beautiful. All I could imagine was a crisp, clear water gracefully trickling by. I had this image stuck in my head. I had this sudden urge to go find it. Not just an urge, but a need to find the creek. Now behind us was a dense forest, and brush, so it would have been hard to find it at night, but it sounded somewhat close to us. Me and my friend looked at each other without saying a word. I knew he was having the exact same thought as me. I said to myself, let's wait for 5 minutes, then we'll decide if we should go check it out or not. It felt like a playful presence was trying to persuade us to go over there. Then I decided we should go check it out. And we stood up without saying anything to each other, and it just sort of happened. As we were approaching the sound, it became quieter and quieter. We stopped, not knowing if we wanted to continue. As we stood there, the noise of trickling water became louder and louder until it sounded like standing next to a river. I said then, let's come back tomorrow and find it. And we agreed to come back later. When I made that decision, the sound of the creek vanished along with the urge to go. There was only silence. The presence I felt earlier suddenly became sinister. It was just this dark feeling of a presence, kind of similar to knowing when someone is watching you. and I felt this fear slowly creeping up from my belly. We walked back to camp quickly without speaking. Once we got back, we started talking about what just happened. My friend had the exact same urge to find the creek, and same internal battle in fighting the urge to go look for it. When we got back, it was like a trance had been lifted, and only then did we realize what happened was not normal. We both could think clearer, like a fog had faded away. That urge I felt did not feel like my own mind's urge. It's hard to explain. Like an urge placed there because once the sound of water stopped, the urge stopped. The next morning we went back to the spot and went to the place where we heard the creek. We looked and looked, but we couldn't find any sort of creek or water. We later looked at some maps of where we were, and there were no creeks or water nearby. I'm scared to imagine what would have happened if we followed the sound of water, because of the ominous presence we both felt. If I was by myself, I would have thought I was imagining it. But my friend thought, felt, and experienced the same thing I did. I don't know what it was, but it was eerie to say the least. What's strange is neither of us said anything to each other once we heard the sound of water, and yet we both made the decision to go look for it without asking each other, and both heard the sound of water becoming louder and quieter, even though there was nothing there. We both felt the sinister presence trying to lure us in. I'm thankful we decided to go back later, because all of it felt off.
One of my hobbies is model railroading. Some years ago, back in the late 90s, I took to building a model railroad based around a small and short logging/lumber railroad, which had existed in the northeastern part of Georgia. The railroad itself had gone belly up sometime around the mid-1940s, during the war, with the majority of the sawmill buildings and tracks being pulled up and used for scrap metal. What wasn't pulled up had been left to rot in place, since most logging cars of the day were just wood frame structures with only the trucks or wheel sets and couplers being metal. I didn't expect to find that much. About 2 hours into mapping the old cuttings and bridge locations, I came to this branch line which curved off from the main. The branch wasn't on any of the maps I had, some of which dated back to the 1900s, when the line was built, so naturally I became curious. Tromping along, I noticed that the rails were still in place, and while it was badly grown up, and the ties rotted, it looked in generally good condition. About 1.5 miles down this branch, as I came around a group of trees, I came face to face with this old steam locomotive. The thing looked like it had been there for some years, at least 50 if not more. It was battered and severely damaged from the wildfires that run through the area from time to time. I took several photos of it, and then headed home. The next day, I went to a local historical railway society to ask them if they knew about it. And here's where it gets weird. Speaking to them, I was told that they had never heard of it, and wondered if I had marked it on a map. I showed them, and that's where I get the photos developed. Not a single one that I took turned out. Those taken before it and after it were fine, but every single one of the engine itself were just black, as though the film had got overexposed. The Historical Society never found the locomotive, and I, over the course of the next year, before I moved further south, kept looking for it. Try as I might, I could not locate it, even following the railroad as I had done before. It was almost as though the thing had never been there. I got talking to a few local people, and one of the people told me that she had seen it too. She recounted that every single person in her family had heard of the train. Day, night, rain, sun, it didn't matter. Lots of her extended family lived down there and had heard of it and had actually seen it. They all had hunting dogs, and sometimes the dogs would absolutely refuse to go anywhere near the cutout where it was allegedly located. They'll be fine 1 minute and then freak out and refuse to proceed any further. It's certainly quite creepy. It's good to know that I wasn't the only one. This second story happened more recently. The job I currently do is for a contractor, and while I can't specifically say everything I do, I can share what happened. I was working out at a base helping with the testing as to whether or not commercial drones could be used by search and rescue groups to speed the search along. While we were testing these things, we had a drone go down some distance away. The operator looked for it, but couldn't find the thing, and noted that it looked to him like it had been attacked by a bird. This happened more times than I wanted to count. Being one of the techs on hand, I was delegated to head out and see if I could track it down, with my GPS locator and tracker in hand. I headed out to where the operator had last seen it, and spent a good hour tromping around in the bush looking for the damn drone, all the while checking to see if it had gotten hung up on a tree or something like that. I had just stopped to take a GPS reading when I heard voices heading that direction. I stopped just outside this large clearing where a sizable illegally grown operation was set up. The guys there were armed to the teeth and talking back and forth about this drone. I quickly logged the GPS location on my phone and snuck my ass out of there. County and the local DEA descended on the location, arresting 2 of the men there, confiscating several hundred fully grown and ready to harvest pot plants. They later testified that they had noticed the helicopters buzzing around all day and figured that the drone was a new DEA device. Rather than getting caught, they decided the best option would to be to just shoot down the drone.
I live at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long, without anything else going for you at least. Excluding a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees, the only employment in the area is at a Walmart, fast food, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from my town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass that I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes there are just really shifty people hanging around these trailheads or just driving around in the Forest Service roads. These are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along the roads meant for 4x4. Some of these people you see in the cars look like the guy that got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it's still a great place to camp. However, you just have to be careful. A few years ago, two of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the National Forest. Probably not legal, I know. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so we could play the next morning too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drive a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up the spot we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decided to keep on looking, so we drive for about an hour and a half further and further into the woods. By this time it's getting a bit dark, and we're getting a bit worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turn off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the Forest Service Rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That said, it looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over it. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road, and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed kind of odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck running, and we set up the tent. As we were setting up the tent, I started to notice that there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I see a green bottle laying on the ground. I take a look at the label and see that it's a bottle of Home and Garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time, and I just thought someone had been dumping their home garbage out here. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area that is more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 p.m. As we're eating, we notice a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It seemed to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like that glow you see over a bright city. We couldn't see the light source itself, though. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend Isaac decides to stay behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. We start walking toward the light source, and the situation gets even stranger. All the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it seems strange that a beaver would go around all these trees and just knock the bark off in a circle. Jacob and I started talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, probably due to the drunkenness. As we're almost to the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, or whatever it was, went out. We look at each other and decide that maybe we don't need to see the light after all. We walk back in silence and keep looking back every few seconds. We decide to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to get back to the campsite. When we get a couple hundred feet from the campsite, I can see my other friend Isaac walking around. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing before. For some reason, he was carrying his paintball gun. That seemed a little odd. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well at this point. We'd probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and was peering into the tent. When we were almost back to the campsite, we saw Isaac walk up the road we came in on. We figured that he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to come back. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent. He stumbles a few feet and vomits. After we left, he had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbles. We asked him why he kept wandering around the campsite with a paintball gun, and he gets a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it? We go and check the truck, enter the door code, and see all our paintball equipment has just been left there like it was before. The keys to the truck are still hidden in the magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing after we left? I ask. I was watching a movie on my phone, and I fell asleep, I guess. But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets? Isaac said he had been in the tent since we left, and that he's been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us are way too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent, we just fold it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump in the F-150 and I start to drive out. When we get to the dirt hump, we see something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier is now back on its stand, right on top of the hump. By this time, all of us have sobered up to the situation. No one wants to get out of the car to try to move the barrier. I had the metal guard on the front of my F-150, so I drove forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It falls right off. It must have just been balanced on top, and we drive over it slowly. We were terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tires as we drove over it, but it didn't. As we drive down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it as the moon reflects light off of it. I start to drive as fast as I can on the Forest Service road, and the other vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though. It stays just 1 or 2 turns behind us. We can only see it when the road straightens out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to my house, but I decide to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't want to get pulled over for a DUI. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place. I'd never go down that road again.
Bonus story. So, I spent around 3 months on a wilderness excursion group called NOLS. For the first segment, we spent 2.5 weeks packing through the Gila National Forest. Now, to give you an idea of how far into the backcountry we were, we carried all our food for around 6 to 7 days apiece, found our own water, and wiped our asses with rocks. Got the idea now? Good. So, at about 5 days into our first ration, we're meeting a pickup truck on a remote dirt road the next day, and had to take a shortcut so that we wouldn't miss it. If we did, we'd have to wait another week for food, and we were already pretty low. We made the decision to cut through a section of private property in order to shave a half day of travel and make it to our location on time. However, we weren't able to make it all the way through this property and still be able to camp near water access. Well, we scoped out the area and found that there were a couple of run-down old hunting shacks, but they mostly looked abandoned. or just used during the hunting season. We found a nice grassy field to build a camp on, and a soft bed under some pine nettles to set up our kitchen area. Well, we've got dinner going, on our camp stoves, tent set up, sun is rising, and from the trees we see a hound bounding over and a long-bearded haired hermit dude screaming at us. If you've never been out in the wild or lived in a rural area, there are two types of people you will find being hermits. One, the kind that are absolutely insane and have spent the last 40 years eating the wrong kind of mushrooms, and own gun collections that will put a city armory to shame. Or two, the kind of person who's moved away from people in order to find inner peace and commune with nature. We were pretty on the fence on which one this guy was. Well, he comes running over shouting at us, saying, "Who the hell are you and what the hell are you doing on my land?" Not wanting to get shot or murdered in the middle of nowhere, we tried to calmly speak to him. We explained that we didn't know that we were trespassing. We were just passing through on our way to our ration meetup, and that we were very sorry, and that we can leave if he wants. He asks how long we're staying for, and we told him just for the night, and that we would be gone by first light. He seemed to not have a problem with that. That went smoother than expected. Turns out, he used to be a raging alcoholic and a motorcycle enthusiast. He got ripped drunk at a bar last night, tried to ride home on his bike, and he crashed somewhere along the way. Woke up 3 days later in the hospital. His BAC was over the lethal limit, and by no rights he should have lived through that. That day, his wife issued him an ultimatum: give up drinking forever or lose her and the kids. When he left the hospital, he found a real estate office, asked for the most remote plot of land available, and built a house on there. He told us that all his friends were drunks, and that he couldn't be around them, and he had to move where he didn't know anyone, and he found this plot of land, built himself a house, and makes furniture out of white aspen. He invited us up to his workshop the next morning, and I was glad that when we woke up, no one was missing. Next day he showed us this shop, introduced us to his lovely wife, and we said our goodbyes. We started saying goodbye with handshakes, and by the end of it, he was giving bear hugs with tear in his eyes. And that's the story of Crazy Harold. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. It's no doubt that being out in the remote areas of the wilderness can be extremely creepy, and is something best never done alone. To continue with the creepiness, follow me over to this incredibly talented narrator's channel. Please show him some love, subscribe and support him. As I said recently, he is amazing. More horrors await you over there, and I've left the link in the description and on screen now for your convenience. So why not click on it now? Follow me over for even more horrors. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.